Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is historian Nancy Siegel, professor of art history and culinary history at Townsend University in Maryland. Nancy's going to talk about Susie Barstow and the Hudson River School. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy.
Here we go. So of course, I'd like to thank Jamie Lewis for this very kind invitation to speak with you today. And thank you for your interest in American landscape painting. This afternoon, I'd like to bring your attention to an important artist of the Hudson River School, Susie Barstow. Recognized for her artistry and achieving great fame in her day, Barstow was all but written out of modern history, but is now the subject of a monographic study, Susie M. Barstow, Redefining the Hudson River School, and excuse the shameless plug. In addition to her first retrospective exhibition in the two-part exhibition, Women Reframe American Landscape, Susie Barstow and Her Circle, Contemporary Practices, which opened at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, New York in May of 2023 and is currently on view, at the New Britain Museum of Art until March of 2024, before the show opens once again at the Woodson Museum in Wausau, Wisconsin in May. Here, Barstow is situated among a number of her female colleagues who consider and reframe the American landscape, creating a symbiotic conversation between past and present. By way of context, in 2010, I curated the show Remember the Ladies, Women of the Hudson River School with Jennifer Krieger, the first exhibition devoted exclusively to these 19th century artists. Since that time, there has been tremendous interest in such women from scholars, museums, and collectors. It remains important that we continue to redefine the Hudson River School with greater inclusivity, because for almost 2 centuries, Thomas Cole, the founding father of the first American School of Painting, as he is often labeled, has come to personify the Hudson River School. But what about the founding mothers? Recent scholarship has provided us with an increased awareness of the breadth and depth of numerous artists who, like Cole, explored and painted the American landscape from the 1820s to the end of the 19th century. In fact, by the middle decades of the century, increasing numbers of women not only aspired to paint professionally, but also achieved personal and financial success as artists, resulting in part from broader educational curricula, the instruction they acquired at home and abroad, and passionate determination to experience nature's wonderland directly. Among the professional landscape painters at mid-century who hiked, sketched, and exhibited their work were the artists Julie Hart Beers, Sarah Cole, Charlotte Buell Coleman, Eliza Greatorex, Mary Josephine Walters, and Laura Woodward. A common thread among them was Susie Barstow, whose landscapes showcase picturesque qualities, a romantic sensibility, and well-balanced compositions, earning her fame and prominence in her day. Barstow and her female colleagues painted in the style of the Hudson River School, routinely traveled to immerse themselves in American scenery. They wrote poetically of their adventures and captured on canvas the beauty and awe they encountered out of doors, inspired by the landscape, just as were Thomas Cole, Asher Durand, and Frederick Church, the male canon of the Hudson River School. These 19th century women artists, including Barstow, shared not only a deep engagement with a sense of place within the natural world, but also an assertion of their place within an art world that too often failed to offer the same opportunities and visibility to female artists as their male counterparts. The professionalization of their career situates these women among the many whose lives and creative practices necessitate a redefinition of who and what the Hudson River School was and is. In recognition of the 100th anniversary of Susie Barstow's death in 1923, I'd like to take you on a deep dive into her art and life. Susie Moore Barstow, was born on May 9, 1836, to Mary and Samuel Barstow, a well-established tea merchant in Lower Manhattan. Named after her paternal grandmother, Susie, the middle child, lived with her siblings, Anne and Elijah, in a series of brownstone buildings owned by their father in Brooklyn, New York. After attending the Rutgers Female Institute in 1853 and the Cooper Union in 1861, Barstow began exhibiting her work in her 20s and joined the important art organizations of her day, such as the Cosmopolitan Art Association. The early style of Barstow's paintings can be characterized as that of the Hudson River School. Romanticized, site-specific compositions with secluded depictions of nature's beauty. Barstow became a markedly successful artist whose acclaim and talent did not go unnoticed. In her day, she was recognized continuously in the press as a professional artist, exhibiting at major venues alongside male colleagues, artists such as Asher Brown Duran, John Frederick Kensett, Stanford Gifford, Jervis McEntee, and Thomas Moran, and realized comparable prices for her paintings. Barstow's paintings, however, are not the grandiose panoramic visions of Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, which reflected the art market from the 1830s to the 1850s. Theirs was a time of great exploration and nationalism, marked by a quest to situate the deity well within the American landscape, a time when wealthy men were compelled to purchase the largest canvases possible in an attempt to rival the European tradition of art and patronage. Barstow and fellow artists, including Jervis McEntee, Julie Hart Beers, and John William Castelier, for example, were part of the second wave of the Hudson River School, an era after the Civil War in which Reconstruction and economic growth fueled the art market, spurring increased demand for smaller, intimate scenes of the American landscape. Artists such as Barstow responded enthusiastically to this call for parlor-sized compositions from a new and vibrant middle class of collectors who were eager to adorn their walls with scenes of the Catskills and the green and white mountains, with their unspoiled rivers, lakes, streams, and wooded scenery, landscape as it still existed, seemingly untouched by progress or war, reflecting a nostalgic taste for a more peaceful past. Barstow commanded the physical landscape of the Hudson Valley, the White Mountains, the rigorous terrain of Yosemite, the Alps. Actually, any mountain range she encountered that offered stunning vistas and marvelous views, all the while altering her long skirts and hiking garb so as not to be encumbered on these rugged explorations. Susie Barstow was undaunted. Whether traveling alone, with friends, or sometimes with her students to places of immense beauty, to study, sketch, and commune, it was not uncommon for Susie to hike 8, 10, or 12 miles, only then to sit down and commence with the task at hand, to capture in detailed studies on paper or canvas the wondrous charms she encountered out of doors, inspired by the natural environment. Well-read, well-educated, and well-traveled, Barstow was a notable figure in the field of American landscape painting. A darling of the New York press, she was interviewed often. She published her ideas about the value of experiencing nature directly and lectured widely on the topic. In a lecture on the American landscape, Susie recalled details from a visit to the Catskill Mountains. Quote, "When I was a child, I visited the Catskill Mountains. As we saw them from the river on a hazy summer afternoon, they lay like a delicate cloud, so delicate and dreamlike that it seemed as if a breath would blow them away. I hardly dared to look away from them, fearing they might vanish. As we approached, their forms became more distinct, but always vapory and unreal, seeming to belong to another world than the river and its wooded shores and villages," unquote. Barstow felt incredibly at home in the woods or in the mountains or by the lakes and ponds and rivers that she explored. In many ways, her practice of leaving her travel companions to tramp, climb, and sketch alone reinforces the power that solitude held for her personally and artistically. In a recently discovered letter, Barstow includes a sketch of a dead tree with a rickety ladder that she and her female hikers climbed to witness Catskill High Peak. Unfazed by the potential perils of falling to the ground, Barstow writes, quote, "I found it easier than I expected, and when I reached the top, was repaid by a magnificent view all around," end quote. The prime of Barstow's career occurred between the 1870s and the end of the 19th century. Artistically, a span of time in which scholars have claimed the Hudson River School had fallen out of fashion, with more avant-garde European influences being favored. Barstow, however, understood popular taste, and her painterly style evolved continuously across the 19th century. Her studies of waterfalls and mountain views are breathtaking for their atmospheric accuracy, reflective of her interest in John Ruskin's philosophies regarding the truthful depiction of nature. And Barstow's studies suggest her knowledge of the pre-Raphaelite penchant for precise botanical forms. Likewise, Barstow's style evokes the influence of Barbizon artists, such as Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot and Charles-François d'Aubigny. Their direct observation was complemented with sentiment, softer lines, and more diffuse forms. Exploring changes in atmospheric conditions, these French artists produced immersive landscapes, moody and romantic compositions that capitalized on a spiritual communing with nature. Barstow was enormously influenced by their work and by the paintings of Corot in particular. She kept newspaper clippings explaining his studio methods in her paint box, which was filled with supplies that included camel hair brushes, porcelain palettes, watercolors, and white flake pigment. Barstow maintained a profound ability to command the rugged beauty of nature as found in the American landscape. Hiking, climbing, and sketching in the Catskills and the White Mountains filled her days, months, and years. She was drawn to climb peaks and explore valleys as part of her ever curious and passionate determination to become the best painter possible. While Susie was documenting the wondrous sights from her excursions, the Northeast, from the Catskills to the mountainous areas of New England and up to Maine, had become a tourist destination, and Susie was eager to partake. In the Catskill and White Mountains, fences were erected, paths were laid, and maps drawn. Hotels were built, providing all the comforts of home, plus excursions, lawn tennis, and cocktail hours. Guidebooks were published annually, offering descriptive advice on important and interesting sites to explore, as well as providing clothing recommendations for both men and women. Barstow would travel to the Catskills for decades, as it was one of her favorite locations in which to hike and sketch, and her adventures were well noted in the press. Quote, Miss S. M. Barstow left last Thursday for a few weeks outing in the Catskills. She will penetrate far into the forest primeval and secure treasures that a more timid worker loses by not venturing into the depths of the wood, end quote. In fact, by the 1880s, multitudes of women were climbing, hiking, riding bicycles, and exercising more than just their minds. Numerous publications aimed precisely at the lady traveler, instructed her on how best to make arrangements, what to bring, what to wear, where to eat, how to find lodging, whom to avoid, whom to seek out, and so on. For the intrepid woman traveler of the latter half of the 19th century, assistance was a mere turn of a page away. With regard to the clothing associated with hiking and climbing, Barstow would have to contend with petticoats, bustles, trains, corsets, and crinolines. Over the course of her lengthy career, she witnessed astounding changes in women's bust lines, waistlines, and hemlines. From the 1850s to the early 20th century, health reformers, progressives, and women's rights activists would have much to say about femininity, idealized forms, and freedom from costumed restraints. Barstow's choices in fashion greatly impacted her ability to hike with greater ease. In fact, her timing was ideal. As she was beginning to venture forth in the 1850s, advocates for women's health had begun to praise increased exercise out of doors. This prompted reformers such as Amelia Bloomer to popularize the trouser, or bloomer, to be worn with a short skirt for easier movement during calisthenics, despite the ire from certain men and women who equating quote-unquote dressing male with a threat to womanhood and femininity. Bloomers of the 1850s became part of a broader undergarment reform in the 1860s after the Civil War. Long, heavy skirts, petticoats, stockings, uncomfortable heels, and layers of binding undergarments hindered mobility for hikers like Barstow, but shorter skirts and trousers instead of petticoats offered numerous choices for greater comfort and safer navigation of rocky terrain. In 1877, Mrs. W.G. Nowell wrote Mountain Suits for Women for Appalachia, a journal created by the Appalachian Mountain Club, to which Barstow belonged, in which Nell advocated for shorter walking skirts. She writes, "During the past few years, ladies who are fond of pedestrian tours have found that their ordinary street costume is not adapted to country roads. To make themselves more comfortable, many now wear a plain, untrimmed skirt a few inches shorter than the regular street dress. This is very well, and if worn with proper underclothing, is all that is needed for road walking." The thought was that by making adjustments to under, not outer garments, a woman's public appearance would remain unaltered. Although most women opted for more traditional fashion, the rational dress movement was built on the premise of comfort, ease, better hygiene, and overall health. Variations and modifications to undergarments were continuously explored to the end of the 19th century and beyond, with many women making perhaps slight modifications, such as shortening one's skirts or applying rings to lift one's hemline when needed. Nowell concluded with regret, "No wonder the gentlemen have been shy in asking us to accompany them in their explorations, for in our ordinary attire we must lag far behind, while they toil on ahead with double burdens, theirs and ours. Our dress has done all the mischief. For years it has kept us away from the glory of the woods and the grandeur of the mountain heights. It is time we should reform." Consider the walking dress by Susie Barstow. Visible in this tintype are two layered skirts adorned with pretty trim, with flowers tucked daintily in her waistband. With her hat and long walking stick, Barstow appears the figure of capability and modernity, prepared to traverse any mountainous terrain that might lie ahead. Thusly, when Winslow Homer painted in the mountains of 1877 the large brimmed hats, walking sticks, long coats, and skirts, indicate that Homer was clearly captivated by the image of female hikers and duly impressed by their stamina to reach the summit. Climbing costumes varied, but the determination and fortitude required of women who traversed the American landscape was unwavering. Throughout her long career, Barstow maintained a number of studios in Brooklyn that were certainly well known to many. One in particular was characterized as Miss Barstow's dainty little studio. Barstow frequented the Catskills, the Adirondacks, the White Mountains, and the lakes and mountains of Maine for inspiration. She made multiple excursions abroad to study art in Britain, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, as well as a trip around the world in 1901 to Japan, China, India, and Egypt with her partner, Florence Nightingale Fallon, a fellow artist with whom she frequently lived and traveled for nearly 2 decades. Susie was also an inveterate hiker. The 1889 issue of the White Mountain Echo noted that Barstow had climbed up to 110 peaks, including, quote, "all the principal peaks of the Catskill, Adirondacks, and White Mountains, as well as those of the Alps, Tyrol, and Black Forest, often tramping 25 miles a day, and sketching as well, often in the midst of a blinding snowstorm," end quote. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle repeatedly characterized Barstow as, quote, "one of the best known Brooklyn artists." And when she died on June 12, 1923, at the age of 87, she was described in her obituary as a prominent landscape artist whose paintings won her wide renown, and as a woman of keen intellectual attainments. Having lived a lifetime spanning 2 centuries, Susie Barstow witnessed a vast array of political upheaval, scientific advances, cultural events, celebrations, and American progress, defined broadly as part of a changing world. As a young woman, she lived through the Civil War and later the First World War. She benefited from the development of pasteurization, the washing machine, and the sewing machine, and watched as New York streets converted from the horse and carriage to trolleys and then to the automobile. She experienced the shift from the telegraph to the telephone, and Edison's invention of the phonograph and the electric light bulb. Barstow attended Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893, making watercolor sketches and saving her entrance tickets as souvenirs. She observed the myriad means by which motion and sound advance in exciting ways. The roller coaster at Coney Island, the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, the escalator, and talking motion pictures. The Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art were all created during Susie's lifetime. And of great importance, Barstow lived long enough to celebrate the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, which gave women the constitutional right to vote. What an incredible time in which to live and paint. Exceptionally prolific and undaunted by barriers of geography or gender, Barstow lived a life that many could envy. She was independent of thought, outspoken with regard to artistic opportunities and education for women, deeply engaged as a woman of faith, and a supporter of both social and philanthropic causes. She was, by all accounts, a joyful and energetic figure, and remained relevant in the ever-changing art world of the latter 19th and early 20th centuries. Barstow outlived the older guard, Durand, McEntee, Bierstadt. She maintained a genuine love for experiencing the landscape in all its wondrous forms and seasons, and she traveled to the farthest reaches of the world in search of nature's beauty, hoping to find foreign landscapes, as Barstow would opine, quote, as beautiful as the Catskill woods. Hers was a remarkable life and career. Barstow's artistic legacy was well established by the time of her death. Yet within a mere few decades, her achievements and reputation, along with those of fellow women artists, were written out of history. In an unexplainable moment of art historical amnesia, the works by these artists failed to be included in exhibitions on American landscape, and with very few exceptions, were all but forgotten in catalogs, monographs, and collected essays. This historical bias against their abilities found their way into scholarship well into the 20th century. But who were some of Barstow's colleagues? Beyond their supporting roles as wife, sister, niece, and daughter, these are talented and accomplished landscape artists who deserved increased scholarly attention. Working en plein air or in their studios, they captured on canvas the beauty and awe they experienced out of doors. They exhibited their work at the National Academy of Design, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Boston Athenaeum, to name but a few of the prestigious venues in which their work was shown annually. All of the works that I will show you now are included in Women Reframe American Landscape. Julie Hart Beers began her artistic career studying with her brothers, James McDougall Hart and William Hart. She spent a great deal of time hiking and sketching in the Catskills, Adirondacks, and White Mountains. An accomplished painter, she took her students to sketch directly from nature, much as Barstow did. Scenic landscape of the Catskills provides a bucolic summer's day, anchored on the right by a spreading birch tree and complemented with cattle cooling themselves in the river. Beers's loosening brushstroke create a scene of languid beauty. Here, the American landscape is on full display. In the manner of fellow artists of this era, the linear crispness of the Hudson River school style blends effortlessly with the more diffuse tones of Barbizon influences. Similarly, Woodland Stream of 1877 invites the viewer into an intimate, secluded location of peaceful repose. Cattle wander in the meandering stream, which is framed by the bending boughs of trees above. The brushwork is tighter than that of the previous composition, but collectively, Beers's landscapes are breathtakingly beautiful and contemplative. With a career just prior to Susie Barstow's success, Sarah Cole, a younger sister to Thomas Cole, stands out as an artist of great talent who was instructed in the fine arts, produced paintings and etchings, and exhibited and sold her work to professional venues in the mid-19th century. This view of the Catskill Mountain House, after a version by Thomas, demonstrates Sarah's skill. She often traveled as a single woman via sloops, steamboats, and stagecoaches, which was time-consuming and at times difficult. Sarah often provided Thomas with support and understanding. Their letters often mentioned financial troubles, but Sarah also addressed her brother's concern that he was losing his artistic ability during the summer of 1836. a pivotal time for Cole with respect to his Course of Empire series and the recent death of his patron Luman Reed. Sarah wrote, quote, "In a little while, you will find that the art will return to you, and that you will return to the art with renewed pleasure. The lights and shadows of this life are like the lights and shadows of your own pictures. The one makes the other more beautiful. And although we have had many troubles and have not found this life all shadows, it has now been a light and then a shadow, and then a light and now a shadow. I really think that your fears of losing your art are groundless." Compassionate words from sister to brother, artist to artist. Charlotte Buell Coleman was born in Waterville, New York, married Elijah Coleman, and moved to Iowa City for life as a frontier wife. But Elijah died within a few years of their marriage, and Charlotte returned to Waterville, embarking on a career as a professional artist. Like Barstow, her style was deeply influenced by the Barbizon artists. Elected an associate member of the National Academy of Design, Coleman remarkably conducted her training, her travels, and her career as a woman almost entirely deaf. Navigating mountain ranges and foreign countries, not to mention the late 19th century art world, quote unquote, impaired by both her gender and her hearing ability. Landscape, circa 1900, with its prevailing tones of blues and greens, demonstrates the pervasive influence of the Barbizon school upon Coleman's style. One can feel the warmth of the sun as if an ethereal veil of air were cast across the canvas. At the age of 80, Coleman asserted that, quote, "Age is no barrier to art." She opined, quote, "I see no reason to keep women from working as successfully as men, except that, as you know, we women are always being called off to do things which no one expects men to do. I believe that home is the place for women, except for painters and musicians. If one has a gift like that, she should express herself." Indeed, she did. It was reported that over the course of her career, Coleman painted 1,500 canvases. Where are they all now? Eliza Pratt Greatorex took a studio in the Fifth Avenue building, where she likely studied with James and William Hart and undoubtedly began her friendship with Julie Hart Beers. Greatorex traveled to Rockingham Springs, Virginia, known after the Civil War for its healing mineral springs and baths. Eliza made numerous sketches, etchings, and 2 oil compositions of this southern vacation destination, including Rockingham Springs from Sunset Hill, circa 1877. Taken by the scene's stunning verticality, the viewer's eye moves deep into the recesses of nature. The shimmering reflections of light coming from the springs carry one through the framing trees to the dramatic colors of dusk. Greatorex was a prolific exhibitor of her paintings and etchings and was elected as an associate member of the National Academy of Design in 1869. Mary Josephine Walters, like Barstow and ostensibly with Barstow at times, traversed the very terrains of the Adirondacks, northern New Jersey, the White Mountains, and her beloved Catskill Mountains. Her paintings were selected annually from 1864 to 1883 for exhibition at the National Academy of Design, among other venues, where her work sold with great regularity. As for her artistic education, Walters consulted with Asher Durand. In his biography of his father, John Durand stated that of the pupils who worked with Durand Sr., it was, quote, Miss Josephine Walters, whom he often advised in the pursuit of her studies. Woodland landscape from the 1870s clearly suggests Durand's influence. In this secluded hideaway, 3 children find shade from the heat of summer under the spreading boughs of the trees. The light casting off the water's edge from this small lake where their punt, a flat-bottomed boat used to navigate shallow waters, has been stowed, brings the viewer's eye through the framing tree trunks and crisscrossing branches back to a winding path that ultimately leads to a church steeple, barely noticeable in the central distance. Lastly, Laura Woodward frequently exhibited her paintings alongside those of Susie Barstow, Julie Hart Beers, Eliza Greatorex, and Mary Josephine Walters. Woodward's paintings were praised in the press for decades. Looking up Keene Valley Adirondacks has all the hallmarks of the Hudson River School at its apex in the 1870s. Partial to the Adirondacks before her move to Florida in the late 1880s, Woodward celebrates the open fields and vast mountain ranges of the East Coast. Cattle on a winding path and a rustic fence on the right are all signs of benign domestication. In portraying a lovely summer day, foliage in bloom, Woodward often dotted her landscapes with hay bales, shafts of wheat, cows, or deer. As we bring forward the stories of accomplished women landscape painters of the 19th century, such as Barstow, we must recast, challenge, and expand our definition of the Hudson River School. These women confounded societal and domestic expectations to craft professional lives as artists, as inveterate hikers in the mountains, as businesswomen selling their work, and exhibitors in the academies. They broke ground literally, hiking through the Catskills and the White Mountains, and fundamentally serving as stalwart artistic activists, paving the way as the founding mothers of the Hudson River School with messages of perseverance and the uncompromising professionalization of their careers. To conclude with a quote from Susie Barstow, "I will overcome every barrier to success, and soon with the sun rising above every earthly conflict, make myself a name and position that will influence the whole world." Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a fabulous tour of not only Susie's life and work, but the, if you will, the other half of the Hudson River School painting canon. I really appreciate that you talked about her female cohort or peers and how they at times interacted and collaborated and cooperated. You mentioned Florence Thalen, is it?
Florence Nightingale Fallon, yes.
Fallon. So could you talk a little bit about that relationship and how as artists they work together? Before you answer though, I'm going to remind folks that we're taking questions, so please put those in the Q&A forum, not in the chat, and include your name and excuse me, affiliation, if you would. So if you could talk about that professional artistic relationship between those two and touch on a few of the places they went to, because
Sure.
the travels are just Susie alone did are just mind-boggling to me in that era. So off you go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, the travel itself is so monumental. And having just gotten back from Europe last week, where, there was a delay at Heathrow, it is nothing compared to what you would experience traveling in the 19th century. The things that she would pack, and Susie Barstow, there was a wonderful trip she took abroad in the 1880s, and she would write home letters almost daily. And she would say, I wish I could just put everything I needed into just one tiny little sack. I'm so tired of lugging around or sending forward, my cases to the next destination. She really just wanted to be out in nature and sketching. There was a wonderful trip where she went to Pompeii, and at the time, right, there's volcanic activity. And she writes this wonderful letter where she and her female companions are walking up, and they sit down. They had to keep walking because the lava had flown, and the ground was so hot that if they stopped, the bottom of their soles would start to melt. Or she says she sat down by a crevasse and she cooked herself some breakfast of bread and an egg. And I think, woe to the modern traveler, right? We're kept so far afield from any suggestion of danger. And this is what she loved. So with Florence Nightingale Fallon, Florence Fallon was part of a very prominent musical family in New York and also Boston. And invariably, Florence would have come to one of the lectures that Susie was giving, or one of the openings at one of the galleries. There was a large gap in age between them, a bit over 20 years. They traveled together, they lived together over a span of about 2 decades. In fact, the Fallon family owned property up in Maine and built a studio where Florence Fallon would invite lots of the sort of cognoscenti from New York. The idea was, right, you wanted to get out of Manhattan and Brooklyn in the summer, as we still do, and get out into the fresh air. And so Sebago, Maine was one of these destination places. And that's where she and Susie spent a tremendous amount of time together. When Florence Fallon's father and then her mother passed away, Florence was left with an annuity, basically $1,000 a year, which, at the time, that was a lot of money. And that, I think, bankrolled a lot of their travel. I think that bankrolled this trip in 1901, 1902 around the world. There's been speculation about, well, what was the nature of their relationship, right? It was very common in the mid to latter part of the 19th century, of course, for women to have these intimate relationships. And whether it's a capital I or a lowercase I could care less. I love the fact that Susie had a companion with whom she could share her passion for nature and travel literally around the world with. When she comes back from this around the world trip, she gives, we don't have them anymore. People used to use lantern slides, these large format slides to project. So she would show images of where she traveled, and she would put out her sketchbook so everyone could see what she had been working on. And really, when we think about what the world was like in the transmission of ideas and imagery, art provided a tremendous venue for people to see parts of the world they would never otherwise have access to.
Yeah, it brings to mind some of the exhibitions or exhibits I've read about where I'm blanking on the artist's name, but the artist who painted Niagara.
Oh, Frederick Church.
Frederick Church's Niagara. This is just one of many examples where it's this enormous landscape, or sorry, enormous painting.
Yeah.
Part of it was the perspective he played with, where it's not, you don't see the rim of the falls, but he puts you in the out over the falls. But it was such a spectacular change of perspective that, as I recall, people were lined up, you paid to get in to see it. And and they were lined up around the block. And this is in part how artists made their money, was some of these. And so there's that. It was, these paintings could be travel logs. And I know that in Susie's case and other, her and other female painters, but just painters in general, they sort of showed Americans everything there was to see in the United States, Yosemite, Yellowstone, et cetera, and had to go beyond the national borders.
Yeah.
Now, did she travel, did she ever go to Central or South America like some of her male peers did?
Yeah, so she did spend a great deal of time in Mexico. She had a family that were in San Diego. So she would travel down to Mexico. She did a large number of watercolors down there. She would write about, avoiding rattlesnakes and things of that nature. But to your point about Frederick Church and that really expansive panorama of Niagara Falls, you're right. I mean, this was also ways in which the tourist industry in America relied upon these artists. Moving out west, artists would be commissioned to paint the interiors of railroad cars with scenes of the American West, ways to sort of panelize individuals to make these travels that were seemingly more efficient and safer now that we had modern technology like the railroad train.
Okay. Edie Knight, who, I love this. She says she's a Forester who was an art history double major. And this is a talk she's been waiting years to hear. So Edie, thank you for sharing that with us. But she was asking if you could talk a little bit about what's going on in New England out on the landscape itself with the forest industry. And the heavy logging that was going on. But pointedly, she asks, do these women have comments about the logging and landscape management in their writings?
Oh, that is a phenomenal question. I've been waiting years for you to ask this question. Yes, absolutely. That is wonderful. In fact, this journal, Appalachia, which is part of this Appalachia Mountain Club, is precisely where these women were writing these essays. And so Susie Barstow has a number of essays that she writes as well. And this was a place for, it was for naturalists, enthusiasts, artists, non-artists. They really welcomed comprehensively people into this club. And this is where you would find information about new trails that had been laid, and also things like the logging industry. There was such a sensitivity to ecology and these ideas about preservation, and they absolutely find their way into their writings. There's a whole series of letters that are shared between Susie Barstow and another one of her friends, where they talk about this. They talk about the changing landscape. If we go back into the 1830s, Thomas Cole writes about the changing landscape with great caution. So we have examples, relatively early on in the 19th century, of artists who they're not just walking through the landscape, they are responding to these changes, right? And we have to think that it was this double-edged sword, because on the one hand, there are those, and the transcendentalists are writing about, the destruction of the wilderness. And on the other hand, we've got Andrew Jackson and this idea of, well, we need to utilize our natural resources. So for as many people who had these cautionary tales, there were just as many, and then unfortunately even more, that thought, no, cutting down every tree brings us closer to economic progress and success and manifest destiny, and this is our charge in this country. So that's a fantastic question, and it's really a sort of troublesome topic, right? There's so many ways that you could address this.
Yeah, and one thing to note about these paintings, although they are factual, and they are in their own way documentary images. So they are documenting changes in the landscape, and may not be accurate down to the number of trees standing at that time in that place, but it's sort of like forest inventory 100 years ago, where they did ballpark estimates of how many trees were standing.
Oh,
Right. So
okay.
I'm oversimplifying, so foresters, please forgive me. But it reminds me of that, where we get a ballpark figure of how many trees were standing or what's on a plot of land. So it's not down to it's not granularly accurate, but it's a very strong image. And that's the connection. This is part of why I wanted you on, was so we could talk a little bit about those connections between and influences of art on science and ultimately forestry in our case. You shared with me a fantastic quote yesterday.
Yes.
That I really want you to share with our audience about that connection.
Yes. So Thomas Cole, this founding figure of the Hudson River School, in his letters, he writes that science and art were handmaidens to joy. And I love that quote because, it brings the sciences and the humanities together, where we tend to see them as these separate people, It's not. Everything is interjoined, and there are these co-relationships, which Cole was very much aware of. And likewise, these artists, whether male or female, these landscape painters, yes, they're documenting what they see, but as Cole would say, they'll draw a veil over nature, They want to show nature in her most beautiful form. So is every view exactly what they saw? No. Does it need to be to make the point about the beauty of the landscape? No. And so I'm sure that there's so many in your audience who would look at these paintings and say to me, oh, well, that bark doesn't match those leaves, or with great specificity, you could do that far, far better than I ever could. So there was a lot of direct observation, and there was also a lot of, making these sketches and these watercolors and taking them back to their studios and picking the best of, right, to create the most beautiful landscape, not only to showcase American landscape, but also to sell these things, right? This was a business. This was how Susie Barstow made her living. So composition was important.
And that's a good reminder too, if folks are questioning the accuracy, is ultimately artists have to sell to survive. And so yeah, but that said, I see that Bob Healy asked something. He asked if Gifford Pinchot collected art. As a wealthy man with big houses, he must have had something on the walls. I'm happy to jump in
Yes,
and
you know
answer,
the
or
answer.
if you would like to address that.
Oh,
So
no, go for it, Jamie.
very briefly, Bob, it wasn't Gifford Pinchot who collected the art. It was his father, James, who was a wealthy merchant in New York, mid-19th century New York. He was a big supporter of these painters, and in fact was very good friends with one of them, Sanford Gifford, and who would become as I understand, the godfather to Gifford Pinchot. So Sanford Gifford Pinchot is named. But importantly is that, yes, some of these paintings did hang in the house in, their houses, because they were that wealthy. One of which is Hunter Mountain Twilight. Char Miller, Pinchot's biographer, has written about that influence. And I encourage folks to look at that. But yes, there is this direct connection, direct influence. We have a question from Rob Hendricks. He was asking if you're familiar with Alfred Runte's book, Public Lands, Public Heritage. The National Forest idea that explores how 19th century artists influenced public perception of the need to conserve American landscapes.
Wow, no, I do not. And I just wrote that down. That will be in my queue this evening of books to purchase. Thank you for that recommendation. That sounds perfect.
Yeah, so this is the intersection of art and science and culture as well. Speaking of, John Dennis asks if Susie knew of, or if you came across reference to in her diaries or correspondence of George Perkins Marsh in his book Man and Nature, published in 1864.
I did not. And that's such a great question, because part of the research that I was able to do was through archival materials that Barstow family descendants had. When Susie Barstow died, it was her niece, Susie Barstow Skelding, who was an artist in her own right, who worked with Louis Prang and in the printing industry a great deal, packed everything up, and it was just sort of distributed among a very small number of individuals. So there was a large amount that stayed intact, and there were a number of books in her collection that I got to see. But that wasn't among them. But I also know that certainly wasn't all the books that Susie had. She was a very well-read person. And so given her real love of being a member of the Appalachian Mountain Club, it wouldn't surprise me if she read that, and especially in the 60s, when she was voraciously reading as much as she could, as much theory and history as she possibly could about art and nature. So that's a great question.
Yeah, that would be an interesting to trace that, not just with Susie, but the majority or the landscape painters in general of that era. So thanks, John, for that question. Tom Cass says he noted that Sarah Cole drew herself into her painting of the Catskill Mountain House, and points out that her brother, Thomas, drew himself into the Oxbow painting along the Connecticut River. I appreciate that background, Tom, and kudos to you for picking up on those similarities. He does ask, though, is Susie Barstow pictured in any of the stereographs that you showed?
No, so those stereographs are from the American Antiquarian Society. But I do have a number of, and not to plug the book too much, but there are a number of photographs in the book of Susie in nature as well. The one of her in her hiking suit, and I have a reproduction of that on my wall behind me, is this fantastic example of being able to show her, you know, what she looked like. And here she's in her 20s. She's a young woman in that tintype. And so, you know, I love that kind of documentary evidence where we can see the artist who's actually there. There are a few examples in some of her drawings where she does sketch herself into the scene as well, where she doesn't identify herself as such, but you can tell that's what's going on. Scenes with other women artists that are there out in nature.
Okay. We have a question from David Lou, I think. He's asking if you could elaborate a little more on how their work, Susie and other female painters, what do you think buried their stories and what brought them back? So this is touching on the historiography, but I think this is really important that we do revisit this.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you for asking that. You know, the fact that Susie and a number of her cohort die in the 1920s or before that, and they're so well known, right? Susie's in the newspapers all the time. She's selling her work, right? People know her. And then she falls out of fashion. And as Jamie and I were having a little conversation about this yesterday, I think part of this is the creating of history in the intra-war years as part of a larger redefinition of femininity and domesticity. And I think that it was very convenient to take women out of this narrative. And feel free to contest that idea as you like. You know, I call it art historical amnesia because, right, when we look at these works of art, we think, how is it? How could this career have disappeared from scholarship, right? But it's not just Barstow. It's the women I showed you and many, many, many others who had these very professional lives. What brings them back, what retells these narratives are things like exhibitions. The more that public individuals get to see these works and say, wow, I want to see more of this, and say to the local museums, do you have any works by women artists in your collection? Where are they? So I would say from 2010, when I did the Remember the Ladies exhibition, and this was on Women of the Hudson River School, till now, the interest has been growing exponentially. And I've been working with maybe 4 or 5 major museums in the last couple of months to negotiate sales that they say, oh, we definitely want to add to our collections, our landscape collections. We need to have works by these women artists. Where are these works? You know, how can we get them? How can we exhibit them? So I think it's as with anything else, right? The more education we have, the more we move this narrative forward. And so scholarships, books, essays, exhibitions, online platforms, all the ways in which we can share this information becomes more and more vital so that people like Susie Barstow don't fall right back out of history. It's part of a much larger emphasis overarchingly through multiple disciplines to bring women back into the comprehensive idea, right, of our sense of knowledge and these fields, for sure.
And environmental historians are guilty of this as well. So, you know, this is not limited to one subfield of history, I have to say. Well, then how did you learn? What is your personal story about discovering or encountering Susie Barstow?
So, as a graduate student, I did my dissertation on Thomas Cole. And so I live in Baltimore, but my background is as a New Yorker. And so if we needed to get out into nature, we would drive through Central Park, right? Like I was not the kid who like, let's go hiking. And so in theory, I fell in love with titles. These images were beautiful. And I felt like I was probably a typical early 19th century New York dweller who would see these images, didn't have really go out into nature quite often, but see how beautiful these images were and thought, I have to find these. And that is how I started to love hiking and climbing and going out into, right, the American forests. And so through Thomas Cole, then his sister Sarah Cole, I thought, well, she's fast. How did I not know about Sarah Cole? Why is Thomas Cole in all of my books? But why isn't there Sarah Cole? And if there's Sarah Cole, well, who else is there? And then, right, it's that Pandora's box moment. You ask this one question and all of this information, right, starts to become revealed. And Susie Barstow, for me, Susie Barstow was in this Remember the Ladies exhibition. And it really was serendipitous. I was thinking about what artist I wanted to take a deep dive into for this exhibition. And I was put in touch with a member of the Barstow family. And they just started sending me images of what they had. They had no idea that their great aunt was so famous. They just thought it was, great Aunt Susie, and boy, she could really hold a paintbrush. So for them, this was this incredible journey. So I went out to visit them and I spent time with them, and their generosity was just really made my research possible. So it's like everything else. Success is built upon collaboration, luck, and serendipity. Yeah.
Well, the fact that her own family didn't know says a lot right there.
Absolutely.
Verna asks a really interesting, Verna, I appreciate this question. How much interchange might there have been between the landscape painters and those doing botanical illustrations?
Oh, that's a phenomenal point and question. It was tremendous, and I will tell you that my next book project is called Pedal Pushers, which is about the lives of women botanical artists. So Susie Barstow's niece, Susie Barstow Skelding, was one of these botanical artists. There is such a strong overlap. And so, right, it's multifold. In terms of education for women as young artists, it was viable for a woman to become a landscape painter, painting botany, because it was safe. You didn't have to even think about the male body. So, right, this was a wonderful way that women could enter into the field. The thing that I love so much about botanical illustration is that, right, there is this very, very direct connection to the science itself. And oftentimes, right, it is a recto verso in a book. It is, you have an illustration and then you have the information. There are fantastic examples from the late 18th century. One is in Deerfield, historic Deerfield, of materia medica. Which is also another fascinating way to approach botany. That this materia medica was written by a male physician, but he had his wife do all of the botanical illustrations. And it's an absolutely stunning book. So yes, there's a tremendous sense of overlap. And also botany was a very popular visual industry. So things like Currier and Ives, certainly Louis Prang, making things like calendars, botanical illustrations on calendars, and holiday cards was very, very profitable. So they hired these women to do the painting or to work on the hand-colored lithographs. So yes, that absolutely those two worlds overlap and collide. Yes, thank you for that.
Sure. And I think another part of that story, I'm assuming, is that if they're botanical illustrators, they're not going out in the woods. They're not violating cultural rules about what is feminine, what is not. It kind of keeps them close to home and hearth. There's that. Another thing I want to point out is we were talking yesterday about this. There are parallels in literary history and literature in terms of the women having fallen out of the history books and are being rediscovered. Victor Harris asks a great question, and I think we'll finish up with this. And I do want to share that a number of people have chimed in just to thank you for this presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.
But Victor Harris asks, were there any Black or other minority women who were nature or landscape painters of note during this time? And can you share anything about that?
That is a phenomenal question, and I'm so glad that we're going to end on that question. Not that I have found, and yet, right? 2, 3, 4 decades ago, people would say, well, there weren't any women of the Hudson River School, right? So this is this call to research to find this out. There are very few examples of African-American women sculptors. We are absolutely looking for the women painters of color as well. Indigenous women as well, right? And so I am convinced that this evidence is out there. It is unconscionable that it would not be there, but we have to do the work. And there's a real divide between Northern environmental history in terms of landscape painting and the South. And I think that so much research really needs to take place in the South to find these women. I know they're there. I absolutely know they're there. I mean, the work that I do as a culinary historian is to find these women of color who are doing, this cooking, during the obviously plantations, but certainly during the Civil War and beyond, writing cookbooks. So yes, it's a very important question that you ask, and we have a lot of work to do.
Oh, great. Nancy, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.